The Gaelic people spoke of a night unlike any other, a single turning in the year when the gates between worlds swung open, when spirits and the hidden Aos Sí could walk freely among the living. It was not a tale told to frighten children, but a truth marked in fire, silence, and watchfulness. They called it Samhain, a festival older than memory itself, older than the standing stones scattered across the hills, older even than the tales now whispered beside the hearth. A moment when summer's strength surrendered to winter's grip, when every flame was more than light and every shadow more than darkness. In that space between seasons, the ordinary world seemed thinner, its fabric strained, as though something just beyond sight pressed closer than it should. The wind creeps across the fields, carrying the chill of a sun that has long since begun its retreat. Leaves, brittle and gold, rustle underfoot, each step sounding a faint echo of what once was. Smoke curls from low fires, the scent of burning wood mingling with damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, the mournful call of a horn drifts across the fields, as if reminding the living that the boundaries of the year are shifting. Fires blazed high on hilltops, their light chasing the night but never quite conquering it. Villagers stood in the glow, their faces shadowed and solemn, eyes drawn always toward the edges of the flame where uncertainty began. Families left food by the hearth, small offerings meant to appease spirits who might otherwise linger with a hunger not merely for bread or meat. Children were kept indoors, their laughter hushed, their games subdued. The older folk told stories in low voices, repeating the warnings passed down through generations. They spoke of travelers who had vanished on Samhain night, of voices that called from the hedgerows, of figures glimpsed along lonely paths that melted into mist when approached. As the fire crackled and shadows stretched long across the ground, the night seemed to draw itself tight, holding its breath. Time felt different, each moment carrying the weight of something unseen. Samhain was more than a festival. It was a reminder of fragility, of the closeness of things forgotten, and of the possibility that the living never truly walked alone. Before the fires of Samhain lit the hills, communities across Ireland worked through the harvest, tending the land and preparing for the darker months ahead. Rolling hills stretched under skies that shifted from brilliant azure to heavy, brooding gray, and rivers threaded through valleys like veins, carrying life to forests and fields alike. The Celts, whose existence was woven into the rhythms of the earth, understood that survival depended not only on toil but on attunement to forces beyond comprehension. The seasons dictated every action: sowing, reaping, hunting, tending livestock, and storing provisions. Summer offered growth and warmth. Autumn promised plenty, but with it came the first whispers of scarcity. The harvest, the turning of leaves, the shortening of days, all were imbued with significance far beyond sustenance. Each stalk of grain, each ripe fruit, each horn of cattle counted, not merely for the body but for the harmony of the community and the unseen world. To miscalculate, to neglect, or to disrespect this rhythm was to invite misfortune. Celts believed the earth itself had memory and will. Fields unharvested or stores left unsecured might be claimed by spirits displeased by human carelessness. As the sun sank lower and shadows lengthened, attention shifted to the threshold of the year, the liminal season. It was thought that during this time, the barrier separating the living from the dead grew thin. Ancestors, whose presence had guided and protected the living, were imagined to move among villages, inspecting homes, observing behaviors, and testing respect. Malevolent entities, less forgiving, were said to roam the wildlands and forests, seeking those who were inattentive, greedy, or impious. In response, rituals emerged, intertwining practicality with reverence. Fires were lit to guide spirits and deter harmful forces. Portions of the harvest were placed at doorways, and masks or costumes were worn to mislead any wandering eyes that were not of this world. Villages themselves were arranged with attention to these beliefs. Homes clustered near water sources or hillocks, their hearths central not only for warmth but as spiritual anchors. Smoke rising from chimneys was more than a sign of cooking. It was a signal of vigilance, a declaration that the living recognized their place in a larger order. Paths through the forest, cleared or marked, were not simply convenient. They were imbued with meaning, routes meant to avoid sacred groves, burial mounds, and liminal spaces where spirits were thought to linger. Children were educated in these subtle realities from the moment they could walk. Tales recited at night spoke of the restless dead, of fleeting lights over moors, and of whispering voices that could lead travelers astray. These stories were simultaneously warnings and lessons, shaping moral behavior while reinforcing the unseen framework governing life. Adults, too, internalized these lessons. Missteps, whether disrespecting an ancestor's resting place, failing to honor a seasonal rite, or showing arrogance toward the natural order, were thought to carry consequences, sometimes subtle, sometimes devastating. Illness, crop failure, or livestock misfortune might be interpreted as signs of spiritual disfavor. The Celts' connection to nature was not casual observation, it was active participation. Fields were surveyed according to cycles of moonlight and sun, each action measured against omens, animal behaviors, and subtle atmospheric changes. Hunters observed birds and mammals for portents, noting when migrations began or when prey became scarce. Fishermen watched tides and river currents for anomalies, interpreting changes as messages from realms beyond the living. These practices were embedded in a worldview where human and natural events were inseparable from spiritual influence. Samhain itself, though later transformed into legend and festival, originated as a convergence of these realities. It marked the completion of the harvest, the closing of summer's labor, and the careful preparation for winter's scarcity. Communities would gather to secure barns, store grain, and slaughter livestock for preservation. Bonfires blazed on hillsides, not merely as celebration but as wards against malevolent forces. Smoke was a protective veil, firelight a beacon for wandering spirits, and the placement of offerings, a method of sustaining harmony. Each element, flame, grain, and gesture, was simultaneously practical and sacred, reflecting an understanding of the precarious balance between life and death, abundance and deprivation. Even in its earliest form, Samhain carried a moral undertone. Actions taken or neglected in this period were believed to have repercussions beyond immediate perception. Stories recount figures who ignored offerings to spirits, who mocked the rituals of elders, or who trespassed upon sacred spaces. The consequences were often dramatic. Livestock vanished, illness spread, misfortune fell upon families, and sometimes, it was said, individuals themselves disappeared. These narratives reinforced societal norms, guiding behavior through a combination of fear, respect, and devotion. Beyond individual communities, the festival connected regions. Across Ireland and neighboring Celtic lands, similar practices were observed, each localized yet resonating with common themes. Fires on hilltops signaled awareness and protection. Masks and costumes confused wandering entities, and offerings at thresholds bridged the human and spiritual worlds. Oral tradition ensured that stories and rituals survived, even in the absence of written records. Druids, as intermediaries, maintained the knowledge, interpreting omens, teaching rituals, and guiding communities through this crucial time. Their authority was not merely religious, it was practical and moral, ensuring that human action aligned with cosmic expectation. By the time the night of Samhain arrived, the world felt suspended. Twilight stretched like a curtain over fields and forests, the air heavy with smoke and moisture. Sounds were sharpened, the crackle of fire, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird settling for night. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose, every flicker of wind a reminder that unseen presences were close. The living understood that caution and respect were paramount. The dead and the supernatural might observe not only actions but intentions. It was a time of preparation, reflection, and restraint. Communities performed the rituals meticulously, ensuring barns were locked, livestock accounted for, and offerings placed carefully. Elders guided the young through ceremonies, reciting verses and recounting stories meant to instill wisdom and caution. Songs and chants were often carried through the night, their melodies reinforcing the connection between the living and those who had passed. These practices were not idle tradition, they were strategies for survival, spiritual as much as practical. Even as centuries passed and Samhain evolved into folklore, the early weight of its moral and spiritual significance lingered. It was a night that reminded the Celts of their dependence on the earth, the seasons, and the unseen. It was a night when the veil thinned, when respect for ancestors and caution towards spirits guided behavior, and when the line between fear and reverence blurred. Every detail, from the placement of food to the lighting of fires, carried significance, reflecting a worldview in which humans were never fully alone and never fully in control. The word Samhain, drawn from the old Gaelic Samhain, summer's end, carried with it more than a season's turning. It was not merely a date on a calendar, but a recognition of life's precarious balance. For the Celts, whose world was bound to the rhythm of soil and sky, it was the clearest threshold between abundance and uncertainty. By uttering the word, one acknowledged that the work of harvest was done, the fields stripped, and the stores laid aside. Ahead lay darkness, the long frost, and the silence of winter nights when the line between endurance and death grew thin. To name it the end of summer was not to describe warmth slipping away. It was to speak of an ending woven into existence itself. Samhain's meaning was not limited to crops or cattle. It spoke to a truth as old as the land, that death was part of life, and endings were necessary for beginnings to be born. The Celts held no illusion of permanence. They saw the world as a cycle, each season consuming the one before. The end of summer was not tragedy alone, but the necessary silence before renewal. In the human soul, they believed, the same truth applied. What perished might pass into another form, just as the buried seed returned after the frost. Samhain was not only a season but a mirror of this eternal passage. From this understanding, ritual emerged. The people did not mark Samhain with idle gatherings, but with acts that carried weight and consequence. The hills came alive with fire. Great blazes kindled on ridges where they could be seen for miles. These fires were not kindled casually, but ritually, often extinguishing all household flames before reigniting them with embers carried from the sacred bonfire. In this way, the hearth of each family became an extension of the communal flame, a spark tied to the greater whole. Fire cleansed and guarded, a living barrier against the unseen that prowled in the dark hours. Cattle, the wealth and lifeblood of the community, were driven between fires so the smoke might ward off sickness and misfortune. Men and women stepped close to the blaze, seeking the same blessing. The flames rose like beacons, fierce against the gathering cold, their smoke believed to rise as prayers into the unseen world. Food and drink were placed aside with equal solemnity. Portions of the harvest, bread still warm, apples shining with the last of autumn's sun, bowls of milk were left for the dead. These were not symbolic gestures, but necessities. To the Celts, the dead lingered, hungry for recognition. If they were not fed, they might take what they pleased. Milk could sour in its pail, grain could rot in the granary, and sickness could creep into the home. To give freely was to prevent such harm. The offerings also reflected a deeper belief, that the community of the living was not whole without the presence of the dead. Samhain acknowledged that the departed had not vanished, but walked alongside, silent yet near. To share food with them was to honor their place, ensuring harmony between the realms. Amid these acts of reverence, there was also fear. Not all spirits were gentle. The same veil that allowed ancestors to visit also permitted darker presences to cross. To shield themselves, people carved lanterns from turnips, hollowing them and setting a small flame within. The faces cut into them were fierce, twisted, grimacing. These were not decorations, but warnings, their grotesque expressions meant to frighten away what lingered in the dark. Charms were kept close, too. Iron pieces hung near doors, bundles of herbs smoldered on the fire, knots of rushes laid upon thresholds. These tokens, gathered and prepared long before, gained their greatest power on this night. The people knew that Samhain was not merely a time of remembrance, but of danger, and no act of protection was taken lightly. At the heart of these observances stood the Druids, the guardians of sacred knowledge. To them belonged the role of guiding the people through the night. They were the ones who ordered the fires lit at precise moments, whose chants turned flame into blessing, and whose words shaped the offerings into bridges between realms. The Druids taught that Samhain was not a night of chaos, but of balance. What the people saw as threat or mystery, they interpreted as the natural order made visible. For them, the presence of the dead was neither curse nor miracle, but proof of a truth long understood, that the world of the living and the world beyond were never wholly apart. The Druids were also the keepers of prophecy. Samhain was not only an end, but a night of beginnings, when glimpses of what was to come might be seen. As the veil thinned, it was believed that the future could slip through, if one knew how to look. The Druids guided such practices, interpreting the flicker of flames, the curling of smoke, or the fall of stones. Water, too, was a mirror of hidden knowledge. Bowls left outside could reveal omens in the ripples of morning frost. These visions were not games, but vital glimpses into survival. A harsh winter, a failed crop, an illness to come, such knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. The Druids bore the burden of speaking what they saw, and the people listened, for the fate of the community often rested on their counsel. Beyond fire and prophecy, Samhain carried another weight: memory. On this night, the Druids told stories of the ancestors, weaving tales of victories and losses, of heroes who once defended the tribe, of kings who led with wisdom, and of spirits who punished those who broke sacred bonds. These stories were not idle recitations, but warnings and teachings. They reminded the people of what had come before, anchoring them to the wisdom of the past as they faced an uncertain winter. In this way, Samhain was as much about continuity as it was about change. The voices of the dead lived on in words, shaping the choices of the living. Samhain's origins lay deep within the land itself. In Ireland, Scotland, and across Celtic lands, the turn of October to November was more than a date. It was a boundary carved by the earth and sky. Archaeological traces suggest that long before written words preserved its memory, people marked this moment with monumental acts. Passage tombs like those at Loreborn in Ireland are aligned with the rising sun of late autumn, as though even the stones were shaped to witness the transition. The light that slipped down their narrow passages on these mornings was no accident, but a deliberate recognition that the cycle of death and rebirth was eternal. The people who built these tombs may not have named the festival as later Celts did, yet their stones carried the same truth, that the world turned upon thresholds, and this one was among the most sacred. When the sun set on the last day of October, the people of Celtic lands believed the world itself shifted. The festival of Samhain was not only a turning of seasons, but a thinning of the boundary that divided the living from the dead. On no other night was this border so fragile, and no other night carried such stories of danger, wonder, and moral consequence. The folklore that grew around Samhain preserved these beliefs in the form of ghost tales, fairy encounters, and warnings that echoed across centuries. The most enduring theme was that of spirits walking freely among mortals. The dead were not distant in Celtic thought, nor entirely banished from the world of the living. They lingered in barrows, in mounds, in shadows that pooled near standing stones. Samhain opened the way for them to move unhindered. Families placed food at the doorway or near the fire so their ancestors would not go hungry. Lights were carried outside to guide friendly spirits home. Yet, with welcome also came fear, for not every visitor was kin. The restless dead, who had suffered violent deaths or carried grudges into the grave, were thought to return with malice. Folklore tells of figures clothed in shadow, faces pale and eyes empty, who demanded offerings greater than bread or milk. To turn them away was to risk sickness, blight, or the sudden loss of cattle. Equally feared and revered were the Sí, the fairy people of the mounds. They were not the playful figures of later fairy tales, but powerful beings tied to the landscape itself. On ordinary days they were distant, hidden in hollow hills and ancient ruins. On Samhain night they emerged, beautiful and perilous, walking roads and crossing rivers in great hosts. Folklore records that travelers were most at risk. To walk alone was to invite an encounter with a fairy troupe, their music luring the unwary into dance until exhaustion claimed them. A night spent in such company could pass as centuries in the human world. Those who returned were forever changed, their eyes carrying a strange light, their speech touched with otherworldly rhythm. The thin veil also opened paths to the otherworld, known in Irish sources as Tír na nÓg, the land of youth. Samhain was a time when mortals might stumble across its boundaries by accident or design. Legends tell of mortals who followed fairy music into hills, or who crossed rivers that shimmered with unnatural light. Some returned with gifts or knowledge, though never without cost. Others vanished entirely, their names remembered only in song. The warning in these tales was clear. Curiosity and arrogance were punished, while humility and caution offered the only chance of survival. Ghost stories told on Samhain night reinforced these lessons. In parts of Ireland, tales spoke of wandering souls who tested the living. A poor man who refused to share his food might find his crops destroyed by morning. A woman who mocked a beggar could be visited by a phantom that drained her health. Hospitality and respect were not optional virtues, but survival traits. Even small acts of greed or cruelty could draw the attention of spirits. To the Celtic mind, the night was a mirror of human conduct. Goodness was rewarded, but any flaw was magnified until it carried consequence. Some of the most vivid accounts come from medieval manuscripts, where Christian scribes preserved older beliefs even as they reinterpreted them. One such record describes the night as a time when doors opened between this world and the next, and armies of the dead rode out across the land. These spectral hosts, later remembered in stories of the Wild Hunt, were said to sweep away those unlucky enough to cross their path. Such stories reinforced the practice of staying close to the hearth on Samhain, for to wander was to risk abduction by forces beyond human strength. There are also tales that combine ghostly presence with fairy glamour. In Irish folklore, the dead were sometimes thought to travel with the Sí, blurring the line between ancestor and otherworldly being. A departed relative could appear at the threshold, but not as the loved one remembered. Instead, the visitor bore the beauty or terror of the fairy host. To greet them without caution was to fall under enchantment, a reminder that Samhain was not a night for sentiment alone. The past returned, but it came altered, touched by forces that human prayers could not always contain. Recorded encounters often carry strong moral warnings. One story from the Scottish Highlands tells of a farmer who mocked the sacred fires and refused to give offerings. On Samhain night, he walked the boundary of his fields, boasting that no spirit could harm him. By morning, his cattle lay dead, their bodies unmarked but their eyes wide with terror. Another tale from Irish tradition describes a young man who followed fairy music despite warnings. When he returned, only a single day had passed for him, but generations had passed in his village. He lived out his remaining years in sorrow, never able to reclaim what he had lost. These stories were not idle entertainment, but moral lessons woven into memory. The belief in protective charms also survives in folklore. On Samhain, people placed iron at the doors, scattered salt at thresholds, and carried herbs such as rowan and juniper. These practices were remembered because of the stories attached to them. A mother who forgot to hang iron scissors near her cradle was said to wake and find her child replaced by a changeling. A man who ignored the custom of carrying rowan on his belt was found wandering, dazed and pale, unable to remember the night before. Such tales reinforced the seriousness of ritual observance. The thin veil was not merely a poetic phrase. It was treated as a tangible state of the world. Streams were crossed with caution, crossroads avoided, and barrows left undisturbed. The places where the worlds touched most closely were known, and they grew heavy with silence as Samhain approached. Folklore warned against sitting on a fairy mound that night, or drawing water from a spring at midnight. The act might summon voices from beneath, or worse, pull the living into realms from which there was no return. Christianity did not erase these beliefs, though it reshaped them. With the rise of All Saints' Day, and later All Souls' Day, the Church offered new meanings to the same date, yet the folklore endured. Ghosts still wandered in stories, fairies still walked the hills, and the veil still thinned in the minds of the people. The old tales adapted, but they did not vanish. They remained part of the oral tradition, carried from hearth to hearth, passed from one generation to the next. Samhain in myth and folklore reveals more than superstition. It shows how communities explained the unknown, how they preserved moral codes, and how they expressed reverence for forces greater than themselves. Ghosts, fairies, and restless spirits were not simply threats. They were reminders of humility, hospitality, and respect. To ignore them was to invite ruin. To acknowledge them was to walk safely through the longest night. As Christian influence grew, Samhain was neither abolished nor ignored. Instead, its practices were gradually integrated into the ecclesiastical calendar, a process that would unfold over several centuries. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Church had established a feast day dedicated to all martyrs, which later became All Saints' Day. The date chosen for this observance was November 1st, closely aligning with the traditional timing of Samhain. The evening preceding the feast became known as All Hallows Eve, or Halloween, and it inherited much of the atmosphere associated with the older festival. Communities already accustomed to vigil-like observances, bonfires, and offerings were now presented with a Christian framework that reinterpreted their actions. Fires that once symbolized protection against wandering spirits were transformed into beacons of devotion, rising as light against darkness, a metaphor for the triumph of faith. Offerings of food, milk, and grain to ancestors and local spirits were reframed as acts of charity, provided for the poor and needy who might pass by during the holy night. Despite the introduction of new religious meanings, many of the older rituals persisted, often in parallel with Christian observances. The protective measures taken by households remained unchanged in practice, if not in explanation. Hollowed turnips with carved faces continued to be placed near entrances, though now the purpose was described as warding off evil rather than tricking the Aos. Iron charms and bundles of herbs were still displayed at thresholds, and the careful observation of mounds, springs, and crossroads endured. Villagers were taught that these acts, while compatible with Christian piety, were essential to ensure safety during a night when supernatural forces were thought to move freely. Christianity also brought new forms of ritual and symbolism to Samhain. Church bells were rung in villages to protect communities from the spirits of the dead and to mark the transition from the eve to the feast day itself. Prayers for departed souls were introduced, in addition to the older customs of leaving food for ancestors. These prayers were often carried out in churches, but also in homes, where families would recite them as they maintained the fires, lit candles, and prepared offerings. The combination of sacred observance with older practices created a layered festival in which the temporal, spiritual, and moral dimensions were closely intertwined. During the medieval period, All Hallows Eve began to incorporate new forms of public participation, particularly among the lower classes. Groups of children and the poor would travel from house to house, offering prayers for the dead in exchange for food or coins. Known as souling, this practice was explicitly tied to the remembrance of souls in purgatory. Manuscript records from the 15th and 16th centuries indicate that the practice was widespread, with particular emphasis placed on prayers for the recently deceased. Souling maintained the association between the living and the dead, even as it became more formalized under Christian guidance. the visual and performative elements of the night also evolved. Masks, costumes, and role-playing, previously intended to deceive spirits or obscure the identity of the wearer, were integrated into communal celebrations. Mumming and guising, in which participants performed songs or recited verses for neighbors, became standard features. These practices allowed older, cautionary customs to persist under a socially acceptable guise. Accounts from Scottish villages describe young people dressing as supernatural beings while traveling from house to house. The emphasis was on participation and performance, yet the underlying recognition of spiritual forces was preserved, subtly reinforcing moral and cultural norms. Regional variations played a significant role in how Samhain transformed under Christian influence. In Ireland, the preservation of Gaelic oral traditions meant that stories of the Aos Sí, ghosts, and supernatural encounters continued to be recounted alongside prayers and church observances. Monastic scribes recorded such tales, often framing them within moral contexts compatible with Christian teachings. In Scotland, similar practices endured, though local climate, settlement patterns, and church influence shaped differences in ritual execution. In both regions, the use of fire, light, and offerings remained central to the observance of the night, even as interpretations shifted. Immigration carried these blended practices to new lands, particularly North America, where they evolved further. Irish and Scottish settlers maintained familiar rituals, adapting them to local conditions. Turnips were replaced by pumpkins, more abundant and easier to carve, and communal gatherings adapted to available space and social circumstances. Costume wearing persisted, now often with a playful emphasis, and the practice of visiting homes for food or alms evolved into the modern tradition of trick-or-treating. The underlying structure of Samhain, the recognition of the dead, the acknowledgement of supernatural forces, and the safeguarding of households was retained, though expressed in ways that emphasized entertainment and community participation over solemn ritual. Church documentation also reflects efforts to codify or influence these practices. Bishops and local clergy frequently instructed parishioners on the appropriate observance of All Hallows Eve, emphasizing prayers for the dead and discouraging behaviors deemed superstitious or disorderly. Records describe preaching on the dangers of wandering at night, of interacting with spirits, and of neglecting prayers for the deceased. These instructions illustrate a negotiation between official religious doctrine and ingrained popular custom. Even when condemned, the older rituals proved resilient, often re-emerging in altered forms compatible with Christian morality. Throughout this period, the festival maintained its dual character. In the domestic sphere, families continued to observe the night with quiet reverence, lighting fires, preparing offerings, and observing the moral and practical codes of hospitality and caution. Publicly, the evening incorporated performance, music, and community interaction, reflecting both inherited folk practices and ecclesiastical influence. Manuscript references and parish accounts describe neighbors exchanging stories, singing for alms, and performing plays, all on a night still regarded as spiritually potent. The coexistence of private devotion and communal festivity highlights the complex transformation from a pre-Christian harvest and ancestor festival to a Christianized observance integrated into daily and communal life. The transformation of Samhain into All Hallows Eve illustrates the adaptability of folk custom in the face of religious change. The older observances, fire, offerings, protective measures, and acknowledgement of wandering spirits, were incorporated into Christian practice, reframed as moral or devotional acts, and gradually codified into parish instructions and written accounts. At the same time, social performance, communal participation, and play became integrated, allowing the festival to persist even under significant doctrinal influence. Even as the festival traveled across oceans, these layers persisted. Irish and Scottish immigrants retained stories, songs, rituals, and practices, adapting them to new crops, climates, and community arrangements. The introduction of pumpkins, public gatherings, and widespread costuming represents continuity of form, even as the underlying religious context shifted. Souling, mumming, and protective customs survived, now embedded in a broader secularized culture, yet still reflective of earlier awareness of spirits and moral obligation. In the present day, Samhain is observed in forms that reflect both continuity with the past and reinterpretation for contemporary spiritual practice. Among modern pagan and Wiccan communities, the festival has been reclaimed as a time to honor the cycles of the year, to remember ancestors, and to engage in ritual that aligns with natural and spiritual law. It is now celebrated not only on the night marking the end of the harvest, but in ways that allow practitioners to connect with seasonal change, the land, and the ongoing presence of those who have passed. For contemporary Wiccans, Samhain is one of the 8 Sabbats of the Wheel of the Year. Rituals are often conducted outdoors when possible, though indoor observances also exist, reflecting practical adaptations to climate and urban living. Altars are decorated with symbols of the season: autumn leaves, gourds, apples, nuts, and candles. Practitioners may include personal items to honor ancestors or loved ones who have died, placing them on the altar or near fires. Some communities organize circle rituals, invoking the elements and calling upon deities associated with death, transformation, or harvest. These practices echo older traditions in their acknowledgement of cycles, their use of fire and light, and their respect for the unseen, though they are framed through contemporary religious and philosophical understandings. Divination is also common in modern Samhain observances. Scrying, tarot readings, and other methods of seeking guidance reflect the ancient Celtic understanding that this is a time when the veil between worlds is thin. While historical accounts describe omens seen in fire, smoke, or water, contemporary methods are adapted for personal insight and reflection. Practitioners treat these practices with seriousness, seeking wisdom and ethical guidance rather than mere entertainment. The moral dimension of the festival remains intact, though it is expressed in terms of responsibility, growth, and balance, rather than direct fear of spiritual retribution. Community remains central to the modern festival. Unlike solitary or family-based practices of the past, many contemporary observances involve gatherings, workshops, or public celebrations. People come together to share knowledge, to teach younger generations, and to honor ancestors collectively. This continuity reflects the older communal nature of Samhain, in which the actions of individuals were intertwined with the fate of the wider household or settlement. Modern gatherings often include storytelling, music, and communal meals, reinforcing connections both within the group and with the past. In literature, Samhain has appeared as both a setting and a symbolic moment. Writers draw upon its association with endings and transitions, using the festival to explore mortality, the passage of time, and human response to unseen forces. Tales inspired by the night often feature moral tension, testing characters' choices in ways that reflect traditional warnings regarding greed, disrespect, or neglect. Folklore motifs continue to shape plot and character, ensuring that the underlying lessons of the festival, caution, hospitality, and reverence for ancestors are preserved, albeit in fictionalized form. Media representations, including documentaries, educational programs, and artistic works, have contributed to wider understanding of Samhain beyond pagan or Wiccan communities. These presentations often emphasize the historical roots of the festival, its cultural context, and its moral significance. Audiences are introduced to rituals, seasonal cycles, and folklore, as well as to the ways in which the festival has evolved across time and geography. By documenting practices and beliefs, these works allow modern observers to engage with the festival intellectually, spiritually, and aesthetically. Even as Samhain has been incorporated into contemporary spiritual life and popular imagination, it retains its ethical dimension. Observers continue to reflect on mortality, considering the impermanence of life, and the importance of acting with care and respect. Ancestors are honored not merely as figures of memory, but as reminders of ethical conduct and the passage of time. Community participation reinforces shared responsibility, ensuring that the values of hospitality, caution, and moral awareness are experienced communally. In this way, the festival functions as both celebration and moral anchor. Modern observances frequently incorporate creative adaptation. While older rituals emphasized fire, offerings, and divination tied to physical elements, contemporary practitioners may use candles, incense, symbolic foods, or visualizations to achieve the same spiritual intention. Ritual tools such as wands, chalices, and pentacles are employed in ways that parallel historical emphasis on marking space, connecting with elemental forces, and seeking guidance from higher powers. Intentionality remains central, echoing the careful planning and moral framing characteristic of older Samhain practices. The relationship between the living and the dead continues to shape ritual expression. Many modern pagans and Wiccans maintain altars or shrines specifically for ancestors, creating spaces to honor both family and historical forebears. Offerings may include food, drink, or personal items, reflecting continuity with practices documented in Celtic lands. Stories are recounted and histories remembered, linking contemporary participants to a broader temporal and cultural continuum. These acts preserve memory, strengthen identity, and maintain ethical engagement with the past. Education and storytelling remain vital. Seasonal festivals often include workshops, lectures, or community storytelling events that explore the historical, folkloric, and spiritual dimensions of Samhain. These gatherings ensure that knowledge is transmitted carefully, preserving details regarding the Aos Sí, spirits, protective rituals, and moral lessons associated with the festival. Oral transmission continues to complement written and digital media, sustaining a link with older Celtic traditions that were preserved primarily through word of mouth. In addition to spiritual practice, Samhain has influenced seasonal and cultural activities. Autumn markets, harvest celebrations, and artistic performances often coincide with the timing of the festival, drawing upon motifs of transformation, liminality, and memory. Symbols associated with the night, including lanterns, autumn leaves, and depictions of spirits, or the Aos Sí, appear in art, literature, and public displays. These elements, though sometimes secularized, maintain resonance with the older symbolic framework, demonstrating the enduring cultural footprint of the festival. Contemporary observances vary across regions. In urban areas, ritual may be performed indoors, emphasizing meditation, reflection, and creative expression. In rural areas, participants often recreate outdoor aspects, including fires, circle gatherings, and offerings to ancestors or spirits. The diversity of practice highlights the adaptability of the festival, as well as its persistent ethical and spiritual focus. Despite differences in form, the festival remains a time marked by reflection, reverence, and community engagement. Modern Samhain also emphasizes cyclical understanding of time. Observers recognize that the end of harvest and the onset of winter reflect a broader pattern of death and renewal. Rituals often incorporate acknowledgement of natural cycles, connecting participants to the seasonal, ecological, and spiritual rhythms that characterized the festival historically. Ethical reflection is woven into these practices, encouraging mindfulness regarding personal actions, community responsibility, and respect for the continuity of life. Finally, the modern festival highlights a connection between community and the past. By engaging in ritual, storytelling, and seasonal observance, participants affirm ties with ancestors, historical traditions, and cultural memory. Practices such as lighting candles, sharing food, or recounting tales of the Aos Sí foster shared understanding, while also reinforcing ethical and moral awareness. The festival continues to serve as a marker of time, a vehicle for reflection on mortality, and a framework through which contemporary observers can honor the legacies of both family and culture. From the flickering fires of ancient Celtic hills to the carved pumpkins of contemporary streets, the echoes of Samhain remain present in modern life. Customs that once honored the harvest, acknowledged the dead, or warded against unseen forces have found new expression across centuries, folded into holidays, stories, and seasonal rituals. All Hallows Eve, or Halloween, preserves the memory of those who walked before us, even as the meanings have shifted from solemn ritual to communal celebration. The Aos Sí, once feared and revered, survive in literature, film, and folklore, reminding us of the enduring human fascination with the unseen. Practices such as leaving offerings, lighting candles, and marking thresholds endure in subtle forms, whether in the tradition of trick-or-treating, harvest festivals, or even quiet remembrance of ancestors. The rhythm of the seasons, the attention to cycles of life and death, and the moral lessons embedded in older stories continue to shape the way communities observe and celebrate the turning of the year. Modern festivals may be playful, commercial, or theatrical, but beneath the surface lies a continuity that spans millennia. The interplay of light and dark, of celebration and caution, of memory and presence remains central. Even in secular contexts, the echoes of Samhain are felt. In the timing of harvest celebrations, in the motifs of autumn imagery, and in the stories that give shape to fear, wonder, and moral reflection. Samhain's legacy is a reminder that the past is never entirely gone. It lives in the ways we mark time, honor those who came before, and shape the festivals that continue to define human experience. The ancient whispers of fire, of spirits, and of the liminal night have found their way into the present, connecting us to a continuity of ritual, imagination, and memory that endures every autumn.